This evening we're delighted to welcome Professor Mark Edwards, who will give a talk entitled The Problem of Evil, Ancient and Modern. Our speaker this evening is, of course, an extremely distinguished academic, theologian, historian of the early church. Just one or two things about him before the talk starts. The talk will last about 45 minutes, an hour, and then he'll open the floor to questions. He studied greats at Corpus Christi and completed his doctorate on Plotinus and the Gnostics. He's been a Hasker Senior Scholar at Exeter College, a lecturer in Classics at Balliol College, an Esmee Fairbairn Junior Research Fellow at New College, and in the meantime, all of that, completed a BA in Theology and remained at New College as a British Academy Post-Doctoral Fellow. This evening talk is going to be very interesting, not least because, as I've already alluded to, Professor Edwards has taught and researched in various fields. To mention just a few, ancient philosophy and its reception. He's produced an annotated translation of one of the most formidable Aristotelian commentators, Plotinus, on Aristotle's third book of the Physics, and has written on the role of Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates throughout the history of ideas. He's even written papers in extremely influential journals on Latin literature, especially various articles on Catullus' poetry, and obviously particularly highly regarded for his research in the intellectual world of the early church and late antiquity more generally, like focusing on figures such as Plotinus and Origen. He is now the official student, which is the Doctoral Fellow in Theology at Christ Church, University Lecturer in Patristics, and also holds a personal share as Professor of Early Christian Studies. Most interestingly, for our talk this evening, his most recent work in one of his most recent works in 2020 was a paper entitled Evil in Dionysius the Areopagite, Alexander of Hales and Thomas Aquinas. So we're very delighted to have him this evening, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Edwards.
Well, thank you very much. And I should add that I hope later this year my book on the problem of evil from Homer to Dionysius the Areopagite will appear with the American publisher Whitford Stock. So the paper I'm giving today is obviously, in some respects, an abstract of the larger work. What I want to argue, I suppose what I want to point out in many things that I've written, is that philosophical questions have a history. Within the analytic tradition, of course, they often tend to be treated as if they were timeless. But the fact is that what motivates people to ask questions and what they will accept as an answer to a question does change from time to time, and it may be sometimes instructive to realise that some of the questions which preoccupy us didn't preoccupy people in the past. Some of the answers that satisfy us probably wouldn't have satisfied people in the past, and vice versa. And I think this is probably not better illustrated in any philosophical issue, really, no better illustrated than in the question of the problem of evil. In some sense or other, the problem of evil can be said to go back a long way. If the problem of evil is equated with the problem of death, then it's a subject of the oldest known work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And certainly Christianity or the Abrahamic religions are not the only religions which have somehow or other had to face this problem, but the question of what the problem actually is and how it can be solved, if it is to be solved, is necessarily going to be answered very differently by different cultures and different societies. Nowadays, the existence of God is usually held to be bound up with the problem of evil. Indeed, typically, as I shall say later on, the problem of evil is so phrased as to be an argument against the existence of God, and it's assumed that a satisfactory response to the problem of evil would in some way involve a proof of the existence of God. And arguably, if you simply don't believe in God, or don't even regard that as a meaningful hypothesis, then there really is no metaphysical problem of evil. The problem of evil just reduces itself to trying to make sure that your own life consists of as little evil and as much good as possible. But it hasn't always been the case that the existence of God was regarded as an open question. Indeed, one could say that for most of recorded history, this has been one of the very few premises which human beings were not willing to surrender. They were willing to surrender almost any other belief apart from the belief in some kind of God. And the modern period, in particular the last 200 years, are probably quite unusual in that a significant number of people have no difficulty in admitting to themselves and everyone else that they don't believe in God, and they expect people who do believe in God actually to produce some evidence for it. And as we know, the difficulty of producing cogent evidence of the existence of God here is very acute. It is true, of course, that proofs of the existence of God or some kind of deity go back a long way. Plato already thought it the question worth addressing in the Laws. How do you convince an atheist that there are gods? Aristotle, in one of his so-called exoteric works, work on philosophy, produces an early example of the argument from design. It's not as if nobody in the ancient world ever did argue for the existence of a god, but one gets the impression, and they give the impression, that this is a fairly perfunctory exercise, that you don't actually meet many atheists, and that the majority of people just regard them as so eccentric, if not to say depraved, that you don't really have to worry about them. There's a passage in Aristotle's Topics, in fact, twice I think he says in the Topics, that anybody who doesn't believe that the gods respond to prayer should just be punished. There's no point arguing with them. Which is a strange thing for Aristotle to say, because in many other works Aristotle himself could be regarded as virtually an atheist. But he would never have said he was an atheist, because people just didn't. Now, why is it that in the last, let's say, 400 years, perhaps, people have really seriously started to regard the existence of God as an open question? Well, of course, many answers have been given to this. I mean, the sort of humanist answer, I suppose, was that people finally became rational. But if we try to adopt a sort of less value-laden historical forms of explanation, then we can say that questions about the existence of God probably arise from waning belief in the authority of the Church in the West, which is at least partly the result of the ecclesiastical conflicts of the 16th century, though one could say that perhaps it was also already a cause of those conflicts. We could say that the discovery of the New World opened up questions, certainly opened up questions about the unity of the human race and the original sin, descent from Adam and so on. But also it has revealed the existence of cultures which think in a totally different way from the European cultures. The rise of science in itself wasn't necessarily inimical to belief in God, and it's well known, of course, that some of the greatest scientists of the past have been very ardent Christians. But on the other hand, it's become increasingly obvious that science has a capacity to formulate and answer its own questions, which simply can't be rivaled by theology. Not only can theology not answer the questions of science, it's just not very good at answering the questions of theology. And therefore, the disparity between the two disciplines becomes more and more obvious. And above all, I would suggest, certainly as regards the problem of evil, our own increasing control over our environment leads us to set perhaps much higher standards for God, if God exists, than the ancient world was likely to do. Nowadays, of course, we think that just about any pain or evil in human life can be ameliorated. We think it can be ameliorated by human technology alone. And so the more convinced we are that one day we might eliminate all pain from human life, and all famine and all shortages of any kind, and prolong human life to an indefinite degree. If we can do all that, then why didn't God think of it before us? Why is it that human beings have for so long lived in wretchedness, misery, privation, etc.? So it's easy to see, in fact, why people might doubt the existence of a God who was conceived as God was conceived in the past, a God to whom you prayed, usually expecting to get nothing, and nowadays you can get so much more simply by going on the internet. As I say, nonetheless, people suffered evil, calamity, privation on a much greater degree than most people in this country suffer, and didn't doubt the existence of God at all. But once the existence of God starts to be doubted, then of course you have to find reasons for believing in him. And usually these reasons are something like the design of the world, or perhaps a necessary being. If you want to follow Aquinas and others, you set up either you set up an a priori argument, or you set up an argument from the design of the world. But in either case, you're really holding God to account. God must fulfill certain conditions in order to exist. If God is conceived as a necessary being, then presumably whatever attributes you want to attribute to God are also necessary. And that means that, and if, for example, maximal goodness is one of the things you think is implied in the existence of the supreme being, then you can demand that God conform to your idea of goodness, unless you're prepared to accept that whatever God chooses to call good is good. But why would you accept that? Because you have reasoned God into existence on the basis of your own a priori assumptions. So presumably you expect God to be answerable to your a priori assumptions about what is good. You aren't prepared to accept that whatever he calls good is good. And that puts us in a rather different position, let's say, from the ancient Hebrews, who do seem to have been willing to accept, basically, that whatever God did must be right. And in the Old Testament, God will even be described as having caused evil. But in some sense, presumably, it isn't evil, because God has caused it. The Old Testament is not a metaphysical book, so it's not going to go into questions like this, but basically, whatever comes from God, you have to bless God, as Job says in Job 2, the Lord has given, the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. You simply accept that whatever God does is what you have to put up with. But nowadays, of course, if God acted in the way that he's supposed to act in the Old Testament, well, you probably just refuse to believe in him. And if you did believe in him, then as John Stuart Mill said, you would rather go to hell than admit that he was good. So we seem to think nowadays that we have our own standards by which God can be measured, and God, as it were, God's right to exist, and certainly his right to worship, can be judged by the standards that we impose. And that, as I say, is actually quite a new situation, as compared with the more typical situation that one just accepted that there must be gods, and one hoped that they would be good, and certainly nothing that happened in the world would actually lead one to disbelieve in them, even if it might lead one to form a different estimate of their characters or something like this. Now, when it comes to the problem of evil, therefore, what we say, of course, is that we know perfectly well what a good world would be, and we know how far short of maximal goodness the present world falls. And so we imagine, what if there really were the kind of God we want to believe in? If that God really existed, what would the world be like? So I put on the handout halfway down the famous quotation from David Hume. If there were a providential deity, says the sceptical interlocutor in the dialogues concerning natural religion, a fleet whose purposes are useful for society might always meet with a fair wind. Good rulers might enjoy long health and long life. Persons born to wealth and authority might be endowed with good temperaments and virtuous dispositions. Now, there's a great deal of tongue-in-cheek about Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, and indeed, there's, I think, a radical ambivalence running through the whole thing, because I accept Hume's own position that only a madman would disbelieve in God. I think Hume probably is quite serious about that. Plenty of evidence that Hume wasn't personally happy to embrace atheism, and yet the tendency of the arguments in the dialogues is certainly towards atheism. At certain times, however, one could say the arguments become a bit parodic, and this could be regarded as such a case. It's so obviously anthropocentric. It's so obviously based upon a rather commoditarian idea of the goods of human life that one wonders whether someone would seriously formulate this and not imagine that there might be other purposes that God has that we don't know about. This is what I think is the really striking thing about modern discourse about God, that there isn't even any allowance that, given that God is God and higher than we are, that of course there might be goods which God recognises that we can't recognise. Of course there might be designs that God has that we have no insight into. That simply isn't allowed for in this kind of argumentation. It should be said, of course, Hume is not not the only figure of his age to have addressed this problem, and there are other 18th century thinkers who argue, if only from the great size of the universe, that there might well be other ends and plans in the universe apart from ours, and that we can't reasonably expect everything God does to be concentrated on our own material gain. But anyway, Hume, I think the way that Hume speaks is certainly the way that a lot of modern anti-religious thinkers talk about the problem of evil. Charles Taylor, in his famous book, A Secular Age, has discussed the rise of what he calls the buffered self, the expectation that so long as we live up to a certain standard of goodness, then any God who exists basically has a duty to reward us. He associates this above all with the Protestant Reformation. That might be somewhat narrow. I think there are larger causes than that, and it's certainly not only Protestants who I think have come to this view that it's really God's business to reward us for being good on our own terms. Even assuming we don't go further and say it's God's business to look after us whether we're good or not, but certainly it's not God's business, to have his own ideas about what's good and evil, and his own ideas about who deserves to be rewarded. The general assumption is that, as I say, God's right to exist depends to some degree on his coinciding with our ideas of what is equitable.